Hey everyone, Ronan here, and welcome back to the channel. We got a lot of things to cover today, but before we get into that, Cronus4i, thank you very much for the support. And also, everyone, analytics are very important, so please take a look at these numbers right here, and the subscribe versus the unsubscribed. And don't forget to drop a like and a comment to help fuel the algorithm. And also, if this is your first time here, please don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications, so that way you'll never miss another upload from the channel. But with all that being said, let's get into what if Brock took the gym challenge, the part 3 finale. I hope you enjoy. In today's part, as we follow up with Joe and Brock, as the two are finally meeting after Brock's win against Alister. The boy comments that Brock had barely clinched that out at the end, to which Brock replies there was a moment he felt like he wasn't going to win. Alister kept telling me that he had given me the win back during their initial gym battle, and it caused me to doubt myself, but luckily Colossal was able to pull through. That's true, Joe says, but what was wrong with Stunky? In the beginning, it started a battle, but then it just froze and absolutely refused to do anything else. Do you have any idea what was up with it? However, Brock declines, saying that he hasn't the slightest idea. Because it was at the beginning of the battle, he didn't even have time to think about it. But now he really wants to take the time to figure it out. The boy decides that the best course of action might be to head to the Pokémon Center, as Nurse Joy might be able to offer some sort of insight. And since his battle was the first of the day, there's going to be 3 more that end up happening before their second round tomorrow. So while tomorrow's rounds are all being decided and Brock's next opponent is going to be made clear, the boy decides that he'll just wait to find out who his opponent is, while caring to his Pokemon is much more important. So with that, him and Joe head to the Pokemon Center, as we fade to the battlefield with the second round being decided, and it's none other than Leon, as he has gotten the chance to face off against the Dark-type specialist Piers. However, since the boy chose to use his Gigantamax in Charizard, and with Piers refusing to use the technique by any means necessary, this gives Leon a relatively easy win. Although Piers did prove how adept at battling he is when his Zigzagoon was able to outlast Charizard's Gigantamax form, forcing it back into its original state. However, the stress of trying to fend off a Gigantamax is exactly what gave Leon the edge, allowing the boy to secure his victory and his spot in the semifinals of the championship tournament. As Leon and Piers wrap up their business on the battlefield with the Dark-type gym leader congratulating Leon on beating him for a second time, they exit only for Jazelle and her opponent, the gym leader Kabu, to take the field. This has the crowd in a bit of an uproar, as Jazelle, being Chairman Rose's sponsor, and Kabu, being the level of gym leader that he is, has the excitement boiling over. And this is where we're going to get a brief exchange from the two, as Jazelle reveals that out of all the gym leaders that she faced in the Galar region, Kabu was the one that gave her somewhat of the most trouble. So she's going to make sure to make her victory as decisive as possible here, to which the old fire-type wielder declares that even though she may be younger than he is, in spirit, they are both the same age, and the result will be far different than it was the last time, as they ready their first choices of Pokemon. Back over at the Winden Pokemon Center, Joe and Brock finally arrive. However, the center is quite busy with the championship going on, so it's going to take a while for Brock to get his Pokemon looked at, which can be a brief cause of concern, as he needs them all to be looked at before tomorrow's festivities, so that way they'll be in tip-top shape, ready to take on any challenge that's thrown their way. But there still is the pressing matter of Stunky, as Brock has released it from its ball, and it is now resting in his lap as he is sitting, waiting to be seen by one of the many Nurse Joys that's been pulled from all around the Galar region. The boy simply strokes it on its head as it sleeps in his lap, with Joe commenting for something that refused to battle and refused your orders during the main championship battle, it is rather calm, which leads the boy to think that there's something deeply wrong with Stunky, as it's not disobeying Brock, and it doesn't have any real issues with Brock, so there has to be something else at play, to which the boy suggests that it's possible that Stunky may be wanting to evolve. It could be that it's tired of its current predicament and it wants to grow stronger. However, Brock doesn't think that's what it is. He thinks that it's something else. The boy can't explain it, but he knows that there's a deeper problem here, and the only person that could really be able to figure it out would be a specialist like Nurse Joy. They need someone to look it over physically, because there might be a solution to this that can't be seen just by looking with regular eyes. While Joe can see the logic in Brock's argument, there's still one thing that's bugging him, and the fact that he needs to figure out this problem, as Joe's always been the analytical type. However, his thoughts are going to have to be put on hold when Leon and Piers both join the two in the Pokemon Center. The two former opponents of the round 2 of the championship tournament have come here to get their Pokemon looked at, but Piers comments that it looks like it's going to be a while with how busy it is, to which Brock holds up a ticket signifying that they had to take a number. So if they want to get their Pokemon looked at, then they're going to have to do the same thing. Sighing, Leon grabs one of the numbers off of the wheel with Piers in tandem, as the two sit down next to Brock and Joe, readying for a long day of nothing but waiting. While the group is quiet at first with the low murmur that is inside of the center with everybody waiting on their Pokemon to be looked at, Piers turns to Brock, complimenting him on his Stunky. He didn't know that he had one of those, to which the boy thanks Piers. However, he fears that there may be something wrong with it. This catches the attention of the gym leader, as he is a dark-type specialist, so he asks Brock if maybe he can take a look at it. After all, he might be able to find out exactly what the problem may be, or he may have something that may be able to help, as Piers releases a Pokemon from his Pokeball. It's here that the leader reveals that he actually has the evolution to Stunky, a Skuntank, to which Piers asks the Dark Poison type if it wouldn't mind chatting with Brock's Stunky, to try and figure out exactly what's keeping it down, to which it happily obliges as it toots its way in the direction of Brock and Stunky that sits on his lap. However, while the evolution of the first stage has somewhat piqued its interest, it still doesn't really show any enthusiasm in the interaction, as Skuntank tries to talk to Stunky while it still sits on Brock's lap. However, there seems to be no engagement between the two. It's really a one-sided conversation that Skuntank carries out with itself, to which it simply doesn't know how to carry on after a couple of chirps of its name and a few growls at Stunky, to which the first stage just simply ignores, turning so that way its head is tucked into the stomach of Brock, trying to disregard the evolution. Well, that's a little frustrating, Joe says, to which Piers simply chuckles. Dark types can be a bit aggravating at times with their mischievous nature. However, he feels that this is just something that they're going to have to give it time. From what Piers can see, Stunky is still relatively young, so there's got to be a reason why it's acting like this. That comment piques Brock's interest. What do you mean by young? The boy says, to which Piers responds, it looks like Stunky is no more than a few months old, even going as far as to ask if Brock hatched it from an egg. However, Brock says no. When he caught it, it was all alone, and he didn't know how old it was, but he has owned it for 3 to 4 months now. Well, I can tell you this, it's still pretty young, so whatever it's going through may have something to do with that. This gets Brock thinking about the day that he caught Stunky. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary. It was just a regular day of training between him and Joe, and then it appeared, and he ended up catching the dark type. That was really it. Then he turns to Joe, asking if he saw anything out of the ordinary. But Joe confirms that it wasn't really that unusual of a day. They were just practice battling like normal, and then Stunky appeared. That's when Brock decided to catch it. Brock then looks down at the skunk as he contemplates something before hearing over the intercom his number finally being called. Bolting up from his seat, Brock holds Stunky in his arms as he tells it not to worry. He's going to get it some help and find out what the problem is with it before he runs off towards the counter, leaving Joe, Leon, and Piers all alone to keep each other company while the boy is gone. As Brock gets to the counter to consult with Nurse Joy, he looks at the TV screen only to see that Jazelle is wrapping things up with Kabu, and her Marowak is in the final stages of taking down his G-Max Centiskorch. And what really surprises Brock is that Marowak isn't even Dynamaxed. He can see that the ground type has really increased its skill and become very powerful in the short amount of time that she's been taking the gym challenge, which means that whoever her next opponent is will be in for an intense battle, so they better make sure that they are on their toes. And that could very well be Brock. However, his trance on the TV screen is broken by Nurse Joy when she asks what he needs. That's when Brock begins to fumble a little bit as he stares into the pretty redhead's eyes, before finally having his gaze broken one more time by Nurse Joy when she says, "Hello, Brock, what can I help you with?" To which he says, "Oh, yeah, I need you to look at my Pokemon. They had a pretty rough battle today, and I want to make sure that they're ready for tomorrow's championship round. And also, can you look at my Stunky? Something seems to be bothering it, and I don't know what it is. It stopped mid-battle today against Alister, and it ended up getting knocked out. I just want to make sure that there's nothing physically wrong, and maybe you can give me any advice on some possible solutions to help it." The redhead nods before telling him that she will call him over the intercom when they are actually ready. She will make sure to check Stunky over thoroughly to make sure that it's physically fine before moving on to any other type of tests. Brock thanks the redhead before turning to rejoin Joe and Leon. However, as Brock returns, Leon Leon does as well, as his number was called when Brock had left. So it looks like their Pokemon are going to get treated at the same time, which is the ideal situation for both, as considering that they're going to have their matches tomorrow. And the last thing they want to have on their mind is if their Pokemon are going to be up for the second round of the championship battles. However, now that the reason that they came to the Pokemon Center has been fulfilled and they have nothing else to do, the trio find themselves in a state of boredom. However, this is going to quickly be remedied by Piers when he suggests that they head back to the stadium so that way they can see the finals play out. With nothing really left to do, there's no objections on the trio's part, so they make the decision to head back, which happened to be a smart one, as when they arrive, they're in the midst of the battle between Peony and Melanie. The four of them walk in to see Melanie's second to last Pokemon fall to Peony's Caparaja. Piers comments that it was a good thing she was the one who got matched up with Peony instead of him or any one of the other combatants in the top 8, considering that she's probably the only gym leader that could actually stand any chance of beating Peony. Is he really that strong, Joe asks, to which Piers confirms Peony's been the champion for a few years now, and even though he didn't earn his championship by dethroning the previous champion, he has been able to successfully defend his title over the last 5 years. What do you mean by didn't earn his championship by defeating a previous championship, Brock inquires. This is where Piers reveals that the current system that they have to figure out the Galarian champion isn't the one that was always in use. Prior, they had a very standard one compared to the rest of the world, as the champion was only faced off when somebody was able to make their way through the championship tournament. At the time when Peony was coming up, Chairman Rose had just taken over the Pokemon League in the Galar region, and Peony was in the middle of taking his gym challenge. They had made it all the way to the finals of the tournament. However, the current champion back then, Mustard, didn't want to have anything to do with Rose or his organization, so he advocated his position as champion, leaving Peony the winner of the whole tournament by default. This is where Leon speaks up, indicating that he thought Mustard was only a gym leader before he had retired. However, Piers said that wasn't the case. Mustard stepped down as champion, and he decided to head back to his home city of Stownside. It was then that he resumed the active duties as a gym leader. However, over time, Mustard grew disenchanted with Rose and the Pokemon League in general. That's when he decided to step down, and your friend Alister became the appointed gym leader by Chairman Rose. Do you know why Master Mustard stepped down, Leon asks, to which Piers says he doesn't, shaking his head. All I know is Mustard and Rose never really saw eye to eye, and that was the reason why he had stepped down as champion to begin with. He absolutely refused to work with Rose, and over time, their strained relationship became something that neither one of them wanted to be part of. That's why Mustard made the ultimate decision to retire. Come to think of it, that's happened with a lot of the gym leaders here in the Galar region, Piers says. They've been replaced over the last couple of years by younger, more capable trainers, people that don't really question Rose. Are you one of them, Brock asks, to which Piers shakes his head. I had actually just come in as a gym leader when Rose took over. I was still pretty young, and I didn't care either way. While I don't hold anything personal against him, he was insistent that I make my gym just like one of the other ones and relocate it to where it was on top of a power spot. However, that wasn't something I wanted to do. I had inherited the Spikeman gym from my father, and he was a firm believer that Dynamaxing, while very important and a powerful type of mechanic that you can use for Pokemon, it could make a trainer weak. So he opted to make a gym and an entire fighting style around it, where he would never have to rely on it. So that's what he did, and when my dad decided to retire, which was about a year before Rose took over, I decided to keep up the spirit of the gym that he had created, and in turn, I absolutely refused to use Dynamaxing in my gym battles. However, that doesn't mean that I won't use it if I absolutely needed it, Piers says, as he pulls up the sleeve on his jacket to reveal that he does indeed possess a Dynamax band. If things get bad enough, I can use it. It's just something that I prefer not to rely on. It sounds like there's been a bunch of difference in opinions, Brock says, to which Piers confirms, as he comments on the battle with the now Gigantamax Caparaja and Lapras that have now emerged on the battlefield. Piers says that Melanie was originally the leader of the Circhester gym. However, she retired so she can spend more time with her boys, and that left her son Gordy in charge of things. While the typing did change in that gym, it wasn't that big of a difference, as her son Gordy still implemented the same style of battling that his mother used. However, when the gym leader for Hammerlock suddenly decided that they didn't want to have anything to do with the league anymore, Melanie came out of retirement temporarily until Rose could find someone to replace her, as in reality she was the only one that was powerful enough to be called the strongest gym leader in Galar. And now here she is, fighting in the championship tournament. This has gotta be at least the 10th time she's been in it since I was a kid, Piers comments. However, this is where Joe decides that he wants to add his 2 cents in, commenting that it seems like there's a lot of people that have issues with this Chairman Rose and the way he does things. However, this is where Piers comments, while he acknowledges that to be some sort of truth, he says it's not the whole truth. You can't expect things to remain the same when the changing of the guard happens. When Rose came into power, there was a lot of changes that were made, and while from an outsider looking in, it could be conceived as something that was bad, the fact of the matter is, it wasn't at all, considering that Galar went from being one of the less known regions in the world to being one of the strongest in the world. Rose devoted himself to making the Galar region and its Pokemon League the premier one across the world. And while I would say that we're not there yet, we are really close. All of the gym leaders here can compete with the best of the people across the world. Elite Four, champions, frontier brains, it doesn't matter. We've battled them all, and we've come on top for most of it. Rose emphasizes showing us off whenever he gets a chance, especially when it's against someone from the outside. He wants everyone to know that Galar is the best of the best, so he puts a lot of emphasis on perfection, making sure that no matter what happens, his league and the region as a whole look good no matter what. Sounds like he's got a massive ego trip, Joe replies. Piers says that could very well be the case. However, you can't deny his results. As you can see, the filled stadium and the broadcast globally for what is happening here in the region. There's not a person that's not watching this across the world. And even though we have 8 members this year, that's more than enough to capture the attention of everyone who enjoys Pokemon battles. Both Brock and Leon look down at the battlefield as the battle is called, with Peony securing his win after his Caparajah was finally able to put an end to the ice storm that the Gigantamax Lapras had created. It's here that the boys look up at the screen as the combatants for tomorrow's matches have been chosen, and on the screen flash all of the contestants: Brock, Peony, Jazelle, and Leon. The 4 are randomized to ensure that nobody has the proper amount of time to plan some sort of strategy that can give them an edge. The way Rose likes it is for them to be on their toes. However, as the selections are made for the first and second match, one of our heroes, Brock, knows exactly who he's going to be facing, as Jazelle will be his first round opponent, while Leon gets really quiet and he swallows a deep gulp, realizing that he's going to have to go one-on-one in a full 6-on-6 against the current champion of the Galar region. As the festivities are drawn to a close, all 4 of our heroes return back to the Pokemon Center to check on their Pokemon. However, as Brock goes to reclaim his Pokemon, he's stopped by Nurse Joy, as she informs the boy that while the rest of his Pokemon appear to be in tip-top shape, even though some of them appear to be a little bit more high-strung than others, the one that has her concerned is Stunky. She wants to keep it overnight for observation, as whatever's wrong with it, she hasn't been able to deduce, so she wants to monitor it to make sure that there isn't something that is a bigger risk for Brock. After all, it being in a battle could exacerbate the entire situation, which is something neither he or the nurse wants, as it just creates more work for her in the long run during this busy championship season. However, as Brock tells Nurse Joy to take all the time she needs, a very real fear begins to set in with not only him, but Joe. That means that Brock only has 5 active Pokemon on his team, and if Stunky isn't cleared to battle the next day, then Brock may have to forfeit to Jazelle because he won't have a full team of 6 to take on the girl. The 2 can do nothing but think about this entire scenario as they head back to their room and settle in for the night, hoping that the dawning light of the sun will bring good news with it. As those 2 slumber away dreaming about the problems ahead, there is a very real situation that is happening just outside the borders of Winden City, and that's the fact that Dynamax Pokemon have begun to pop up all in the surrounding area. The tremors have been getting worse as the day goes on, and it's to the point that they're happening around every 10 to 15 minutes or so, with them getting more and more intense than the previous set. It's so bad that all of the Galarian gym leaders are called into action overnight to combat this growing force of hostiles, as every outbreak brings with it a surge of crazed Pokemon that have no idea or faculties about them. All they can think of is Rampage and destruction, while Rose watches from his ivory tower as the events unfold, musing to himself as the plans unfold. However, this is quickly brought to a halt when he gets word that his brother, the champion of the region Peony, has decided that he is going to join in the efforts to subdue all of the wild rampaging Pokemon. However, Rose is unable to reach him in time as he heads off into the wilds beyond Winden. What follows is a night of battling by moonlight as all of the gym leaders in Peony do their best to subdue all of the rampaging wilds. Luckily, by the time the first light breaks the dawn, most of the threats have been dealt with, as Joe and Brock find themselves in the cafeteria of the Pokemon Center, eating away. The two have remained stoic during their meal, as the reality of what could actually be happening has set in for both of them. After they are done here, they have to go pick up Stunky, and if Stunky isn't cleared to battle because Brock doesn't have any other Pokemon, he's gonna have to forfeit to Jazelle, and this eventually becomes too much for Joe to take, as he finally breaks the silence, asking Brock what he's gonna do. However, the boy just says, let's not worry about it. Let's focus on the positives. Maybe Stunky just needed a good night's rest, and then everything's gonna be good, and it'll be ready to battle today, the boy says before standing up from the table and taking off to the trash can to get rid of all of his waste, before Joe follows in tandem and they head off to the main counter. However, unfortunately, it's rather busy, and it takes a while for them to be seen, as the Nurse Joy that was looking after Stunky is nowhere to be found. It even gets to the point to where Brock has to ask one of the other Nurse Joys to make a call over the intercom for her to come to them, which takes nearly an additional hour before she is finally able to make her way to the front to see the boys. But unfortunately for Brock, he is met with bad news. Whatever the issue is with Stunky hasn't resolved itself, and Nurse Joy, because of the influx of all the people that have been coming to the Pokemon Center, and because of the rampages from the previous night, has been busy non-stop. She hasn't even been able to sleep, which means that her monitoring of the dark type has been very minimal, but the last time she checked on it, there was no change, which was about 30 minutes prior to this conversation. The nurse then tells Brock that she's sorry, but she can't clear Stunky for a battle today. The boy hangs his head, came to Galar and tried so hard to get to this point, and now he's going to be stopped because one of his Pokemon are unable to battle. However, he cares more for their safety than he does for the actual win. So, reluctantly, he accepts this news, telling Nurse Joy he appreciates all of her input and all of the effort she's putting in, even though she's been stretched so thin. The redhead then tries to say something, however she's called away due to another emergency before she can make the statement, merely telling Brock that she'll be back in a little while to check on him and Stunky. This leaves just him and Joe standing there in the Pokemon Center with little options to them. The two stand silent before Brock finally speaks up, saying he has an idea, something he's been thinking about all morning, though it's not one that he likes. Turning, Joe asks what it is, to which Brock calmly replies he can always call his dad and have him send over one of his Pokemon or his mother's other Pokemon from the gym. While he doesn't exactly like this idea, it is kind of his last option, though it's not that bad of one considering that he is using his mother's Gyarados and the Pokemon that his father gave him, so there is some sort of precedent for this. However, Joe stops him right there. You can't do that. You can't continue to rely on your parents for everything, Brock. It was your father and his connections that got you into the Galar League, even though you didn't know it at the time. It was your mother's Gyarados that allowed you to proceed through the ranks of the region and earn each of the badges with the help of your other Pokemon. It's time that you finally started standing on your own 2 feet. While that's a great idea in theory, Brock says, he highly doubts that it'll be able to be executed, considering that there's no one else he can really rely on, and because he hadn't caught more than 6 Pokemon, that means he's gonna have to forfeit to Jazelle. Joe says, that's not what I was suggesting. Well, if you have any ideas, I'm all ears, Brock says, to which Joe responds, how about instead of you relying on your parents, you rely on a friend? I've been traveling with you the whole time, Brock, and though I'm not on the same level of skill as you, and I'm not as strong as a trainer as you, you do have to admit that we know each other's Pokemon pretty well, inside and out. So what if you used one of mine just for this battle, in hopes that it'll give Stunky enough time to come around? Brock is reluctant to do this. After all, he doesn't even know if it would be legal, and since he's come to Galar, he's done quite a few questionable things, and he wouldn't want to tempt fate once again. However, Joe tells the boy that it's not. He spent all night looking up the rules of the Galar League after what Leon and Piers had told him about Rose. He wanted to make sure that this offer was completely legit, so that way Brock wouldn't run the risk of getting disqualified. And it turns out there's nothing that's written in stone against this type of action. You just have to have 6 Pokemon in order to battle. However, Brock still isn't convinced, telling the boy that it wouldn't be a true win that his Pokemon earned if they had assistance from another friend. However, Joe reminds Brock that the person they are battling is Jazelle, and whether Brock wants to admit it or not, both of their Pokemon have the same end goal in common. They want a chance to beat her bratty butt and hand her the defeat that she's been deserving the entire time that they've been in the region. Brock looks to Joe, then to the floor, before we fast forward a couple of hours later in Winden Stadium, where Jazelle stands on the battlefield with a packed crowd all around her. She is loving the admiration of her adoring fans. She can't think of a better place to deal Brock the defeat that he has been deserving of for so long. The only thing she could do is look with a smile on her face down the battlefield as Brock enters, only for the referee to ask if the two are ready, to which both Brock and Jazelle nod. With the roar of the crowd and the ref giving the official okay to start, both trainers ready a Pokeball as Jazelle screams to Brock, letting him know that this will be the perfect defeat she's envisioned on giving him ever since that day they met at the school. So, to at least put up a fight, after all, she doesn't want the win to be easy. She wants to savor this victory, as she declares, "Surfetched, go!" The fully evolved regional bird takes the field as it pops from the ball, swinging its mighty leak around, ready to deal some major damage with a massive club sword. So, your Farfetch'd evolved, did it? Brock thinks to himself. Well, it looks like I'm gonna have my work cut out for me, but I know that my Pokemon will not let me down, as he grips his Pokeball tight before declaring, "Galvantula, your time to battle!" As the electric spider emerges from the ball, Jazelle comments that Brock shouldn't get too cocky. After all, she did get a chance to see his entire battle against Alister, so she has a generally good idea of what his team is going to be and what they're capable of. As the wave to start the first round is given, and she declares, "Surfetch'd, use Brave Bird." Using its leak as a pole vault, the fighting type takes to the sky before glowing in a fiery aura as it begins its descent to crash down onto Galvantula. However, Brock figured Jazelle might try something like this, and this is the reason why he chose the spider in the first place, as he orders it to use an electro whip that ensnares the fighting type before it can make contact. The boy is feeling pretty confident that he was able to successfully counter Jazelle's first move. However, the girl was actually 2 steps ahead of him, as Surfetch'd pushes straight through the electric type attack and collides with Galvantula, leaving the two in a crater with a cloud of dust. This immediately makes the hairs on the back of Brock's neck stand up, as he's unsure that his Pokemon was able to survive that. However, as the dust begins to settle, Brock can see that Galvantula was able to indeed survive, as he and Surfetch'd are locked in a brutal struggle, trying to establish dominance over one another, with the fighting type using its leak to try and gain any type of advantage that it could. However, Galvantula's extra legs provided the perfect stability that it needs to prevent it from being overtaken. This gives Brock an idea. With his spider using its forearms to block the leak, Brock has an epiphany. While Surfetch'd is a fighting type, the leak is actually native grass, which means it should technically be weak to a bug type move, as he commands Galvantula to use an X-Scissor. With its frontal legs now glowing in a verdant energy, Galvantula is able to power through, cutting into the leak before striking Surfetch'd and dealing its own bit of damage. However, unfortunately for the bug type, that move wasn't enough to cause any serious damage to Surfetch'd, as it's shown here when Jazelle commands it to use a Brick Break, as the fighting type uses its leak to bring down on the head of Galvantula, striking it back into the ground once again. While this still isn't enough to end the spider, Brock can tell that it's looking a little woozy, so he makes a decision to recall it for the time being. This gives Jazelle a strange sense of accomplishment, because even though her Pokemon wasn't able to earn her a win, it did in fact put Brock on the back foot, which is a step in the right direction for her to claim victory over her former classmate. However, she's gonna realize that she has her work cut out for her, as Brock is no longer messing around, taking a chance on his most volatile team member, declaring, "Thwacky, your time to battle." The grass monkey emerges from its balls with its 2 sticks deployed, ready to engage in some combat. However, Jazelle is still feeling pretty confident from that previous exchange, and she knows that Surfetch'd, being a fighting type, has the perfect coverage to deal with Thwacky, as she tells it she will be using using it in the next battle, before the command is given for them to start, and she commands for the fighting type to use a leaf blade. However, this is countered by Brock easily when he commands Thwackey to use a branch poke. However, it's not to be used as an offensive move, but as a defensive move to deter the giant leek from crashing down on Thwackey. And luckily for the grass starter, it has enough power to deflect the leek with just one of its sticks, leaving the second one free for it to come down and crack Sirfetch'd over the head. Now, while this isn't the most intense of attacks, it is enough to make a statement. Thwackey isn't going to be taken out that easily, and Jazelle better come up with a different plan if she hopes to cause any serious damage to it. However, she fails to get the message, as she tells Sirfetch'd it's time to get back in there. Try a brutal swing, to which Brock simply thinks to himself, you want to see brutal? Alright. Thwackey, use double hit. The moss-covered simian begins to tear down the battlefield, as it swings its arms violently before colliding with the leek once more. However, the attack is brutal only in nature, as Thwackey shows it the real intensity that would needed to be hit by it, when it uses its first forearm to block the leek and its second forearm to push through and once again cracks Sirfetch'd. However, this time it has a much serious effect, as Sirfetch'd is also hit with its own leek in the process, knocking the bird out and giving Brock the early lead in this battle. This surprises Jazelle a bit. While she did see Thwackey the day before, and she has had past experiences with it, she wasn't expecting to have that type of power to overcome Sirfetch'd. It's duly noted she's going to need to be careful going forward. All the while, Chairman Rose is watching on from the VIP room, thinking to himself that this girl may have been a waste of time considering she took the first loss. However, her next choice may be one that can rebuild Chairman Rose's confidence in her, as we pan back to the battlefield with Jazelle declaring, "Slow bro, go!" What pops from the ball is very much a slow bro, as it looks very similar to what Brock has seen before. However, it is slightly different, and this catches the boy's attention. He knows that he may have to be cautious with this thing, and Thwackey isn't exactly the Pokemon that's known for that. So, for the moment, he contemplates recalling the simian until it lets out a loud battle cry as it's ready to engage with Jazelle. Knowing that it may not be in his best interest to recall it for the time being due to the starter being so engaged with this battle, Brock decides to carry on, as the signal for this round is given and Brock takes the first command, calling for a branch poke from the starter, to which Thwackey is more than happy to do, considering it wants to get up close and personal so that way it can engage in some hand-to-hand combat. However, it's going to find out real quick why exactly Jazelle decided to go with this Pokemon. As the branch poke connects and causes a bit of damage, she decides to retaliate with a simple command, disable. Suddenly, the eyes of the Slowpoke begin to glow in a purple aura before Thwackey is frozen in place. The grass type begins to growl as it's unable to move, very upset with the current circumstances. However, that's going to be the least of its problems, as Brock orders it to use a knockoff to try and break free. However, Thwackey is unable to move, to which Jazelle gladly flexes her newest Pokemon by using the advantage that it's created for itself and declaring for it to use a shell sidearm. Suddenly, the shoulder that's on the left wrist of the Slowbro begins to swell as something begins to ooze from it before Slowbro fires in the direction of Thwackey, coating it in some sort of purple ooze that causes the simian to scream. However, this is no longer out of frustration, but out of pain, as the ooze seeps into the grass type for super effective damage. Wait, what was that? Brock says, to which Jazelle simply chuckles to herself. You like that? That was Sidearm Shell. It's going to deal damage whichever is greater between the attack and special attack, and unfortunately for your Thwackey, it's a poison type move, which means it's going to cause as much damage as possible, as Brock watches Thwackey go limp as Slowbro subsides its attack and the simian falls to the battlefield, unable to move, giving Jazelle the win in this exchange. Recalling them on, Brock considers his options. So this thing is a poison psychic type, he thinks to himself, which he reaffirms by taking out his Pokédex to gain some info on it. And he comes to realize that not only is this thing a poison psychic type, but it's just as tanky as its Cantonian counterpart, which means Brock's gonna have to be careful. He's gonna need something that can deal some massive damage. And unfortunately, the normal ways of doing that by using his water weakness to his advantage isn't something that he'll be able to do. However, he does have some idea on how to combat this, as he thinks the best way to go about it is to make that sidearm shell completely immobile as he declares, "Berserker, your time to battle." Hobocat emerges from the ball as it drools and its stench begins to permeate the area, causing both Jazelle and Slowbro to flinch slightly, realizing that Brock is up to something and he's trying to give himself as much of an advantage against her as possible. Jazelle decides to recall her Pokemon for the time being, as she figures that she has something that's going to make things a little bit easier on herself, as she declares, "Haxorus, go!" The blade-faced dragon emerges from its Pokeball as it lets out an ear-deafening growl in an attempt to intimidate Hobocat. However, it remains unflinching, simply staring at the dragon with that clueless expression that it normally has as drool continues to seep down its beard. However, there is one that has a cause for concern as the signal for this match is given to begin. Brock tells Jazelle she shouldn't be using a Pokemon that she can't control. "Oh, what makes you think I can't control it?" she says as she gives a command for a dragon dance. And in tandem, Haxorus responds to the girl as it begins to glow in an energy and wave about, performing its ritual, while Brock watches on, knowing full well what this means due to Gyarados. The boy immediately tells Berserker that they need to reciprocate this by ordering a Hone Clause to increase its attack stat as high as it possibly can. However, Jazelle's not going to give him a chance to complete this move, as her dragon is now on the attack, as both of the blades on the side of its head glow with her command of a dual chop as they strike the steel type across the face. However, Berserker seems unfazed by this, as it was able to easily counter it with the command that Brock had given it to use an Iron Head. While Haxorus is far larger in stature, the truth is Berserker may be at a higher level, considering it was owned by a previous Pokemon before, which is a detail that Jazelle isn't quite aware of, as Berserker is able to use Haxorus's leverage in height against it by simply slipping under the dragon type as its face is driven into the ground. It then follows up with the payday at the command of Brock as it rakes its claws across the belly of the beast, exiting from underneath its legs. This leaves the dragon screaming in pain as it stands back up looking for its target, to which Jazelle orders Haxorus to get it together. She didn't choose it so that way it could lose. This is a mangy cat, and it should be able to easily deal with it. Now, use an X-Scissor! Again, the blades on the side of its face begin to glow in a verdant energy this time, as it looks to drive them into the head of the steel type. However, Brock is quick to counter. As Haxorus brings down its blades, once more he commands for another Iron Head, which is able to easily overpower the bug-type move as Berserker fights back, driving Haxorus into the ground. Now, while this isn't enough to take out the dragon type, it is enough to send a clear message. Both of them have underestimated this feline, and it's not something that they can continue to do if they hope to win. Brock is feeling pretty confident at this point, as Berserker is as well, so the boy tells it that it's time for them to turn on the pressure. Use another Iron Head. However, Jazelle grows tired of this exchange, and she knows that Haxorus can only take so much damage before it's going to eventually fall. It's clear to her now that this Pokemon is a much higher level than her dragon, so she aims to end this in one swoop, using Haxorus's increased speed to its advantage as she commands for a close combat. What follows is a smashing contest between the two Pokemon as they use their heads, driving them into each other with as much force as possible. Now, while they both have increased stats at this point, the unfortunate fact that Haxorus has taken much more damage than Berserker is going to come into play, as the Iron Head is able to push through the close combat, driving itself into the face of Haxorus and dropping the dragon, giving Brock another lead. However, as the ref begins to declare Haxorus is unable to battle, Berserker doubles over, as it now has spirals in its eyes, having finally succumbed to the damage it took from the increased stats of that close combat, making this a double knockout. As both trainers recall their Pokemon, they find themselves in a precarious position, as that was a double knockout and they both only have 4 Pokemon left. Mulling over their decisions, this next choice could be what swings the battle in their respective favors. They both in tandem reach for their next choices as they send them in. Colossal, your time to battle. Marowak, go! The two rival Mons hit the battlefield, ready to settle the score between them. The tension fills the air as the crowd goes silent with the wave to start this next battle, and Brock taking the first command, ordering a flame charge, while Jazelle, ever confident in her starter's abilities, decides she's going to play the long game as she calls for a focus energy, which allows Marowak to tighten its internal focus before it takes the fiery attack as Colossal slams its thick hide into the ground type. While this move wasn't very effective, that wasn't what Brock was going for. He wants his Colossal to be able to keep up with the speed speed of Marowak, which is going to be demonstrated here, calling for a bone rush. Brock hopes that the speed increase that he got from Flame Charge was enough, as he decides to try and counter with the Rapid Spin. While this is enough to shake off some of the strikes from the bone of Marowak, it's not enough to deter all of them, as Colossal eventually succumbs to the rapid hits that it is forced to take. While the barrage of bones wasn't enough to take out the dual type, it definitely felt it due to having the fire and rock typing. However, the living pile of coal stands up, shaking off whatever damage it just took, ready to engage in a second battle, which it's not going to have to wait for, as Jazelle is quick on the assault with a double kick from Marowak that delivers both of its feet firm into the gut of the rock type. However, Brock wanted it to get close, as he realized that Colossal wasn't fast enough to keep up with Marowak. So as it's forced to endure another super effective strike against it, Brock calls for a tar shot. That should bring you down to Colossal's level of speed, Brock thinks to himself. However, Jazelle isn't going to wait around. As the Bone Keeper, he uses its club to detour most of the gunk from getting stuck on it. And luckily for the girl, this allows it to stay somewhat mobile, as it's able to break the hold that Colossal has on it before putting some much needed distance, though it is obvious that it did take a hit to its speed because of the tar shot. Thinking that she needs to play it a little safe, she goes for another focus energy, which causes Marowak to close its eyes ever so slightly. However, Brock is going to take advantage of this free opening, calling for another flame charge that Colossal puts everything it has into to slam into Marowak. While this is going to allow Colossal to become faster, Jazelle is feeling pretty confident in this, as Marowak being a ground type isn't going to take that much damage. That is, until she learns firsthand what the effects of Tar Shot is, as Hermon too is engulfed in flames, with Colossal slamming its thick hide straight into it. This hits it for much more damage, causing it to slide across the battlefield. However, Marowak maintains its stance, as its eyes open with the glow, signaling that its focus is ready, and awaiting her command, which Jazelle is going to use to her advantage as she orders Marowak in with a bone rush. However, Colossal's speed is now at a point to where Brock feels confident, as he orders the rock type to use a rapid spin, which it's able to easily evade the ground type move. However, Jazelle isn't going to let them get away with this. As Colossal comes to a stop, Marowak is on top of it with the move that Jazelle really wanted to use, something called a stomping tantrum. The ground type is thudding its feet into the ground, causing vibrations as it closes in on Colossal before striking it in its gut once again with the bone. While Brock feels confident that wasn't enough to take out his Mon, he's going to come to a harsh realization when Colossal doubles over with spirals in its eyes, with Jazelle and Marowak being declared the victor. The boy doesn't understand. There's no way that was strong enough to take out his starter. However, Jazelle is glad to elaborate. With the stacking of the focus energies, plus the fact that it missed the bone rush due to Brock's evasion, the stomping tantrum had gained some serious power. Enough power to one-shot the boy's starter. This is where an aura of confidence begins to consume Jazelle, as she tells the boy, "Can't you see? This is what I've been aiming for the entire time. I wanted to bring down your starter before I started to pick apart the rest of your team, and now you only have 3 Pokemon left to my 4, and I guarantee you they will each fall one by one." Brock can do nothing but look on as he considers his next options, as we pan to the outside of the stadium, where we finally catch up with the champion of the region, Peony, as he is using a device that was created for him by the one and only Professor Magnolia. He had requested her to make something that could track Dynamax energy, as with all of these recent spikes, he figured that if they were to happen again, he may be able to find the epicenter of it. However, the champion is not liking what he has seen, considering that this device is pointing straight into Winden. The epicenter of these tremors are coming from within inside of the city, which is a grave cause of concern for the champion, as all of the people there could be in great danger if whatever the cause of this is decides it wants to unleash all of its energy at once. Galar's #1 trainer wastes no time heading into the city until he finds himself in front of a place that he didn't think that he would actually have to be in front of, which is none other than Rose Tower, the place his brother built as kind of a monument to himself. However, Peony remains reserved in his opinions, as he wants to get to the bottom of this before he confronts anybody. So without hesitation, he heads inside. However, as he follows the source of the energy and the tracker begins to beep wildly, he is met with some of his brother's armed personal guard. They're telling the champion that he's not permitted beyond a certain point inside of the tower, to which he finds absolutely absurd. There's no place that is off restrictions to the champion of the Galar region, or for that matter, the brother of the chairman of the league, so he orders them to stand aside. However, both of the guards remain resolute, telling the champion that he is going to have to just turn around, or they'll be forced to remove him with any means necessary. This gets a brief smile across the champion's face, as he's not one to shy away from challenges, before telling both of them that he accepts their terms, sending in his Copper Raja, causing both of them to gulp as they just realized the champion called their empty bluff, forcing them to run off out of fear of being trampled by the massive steel type. Peony simply shrugs, a bit dissatisfied with the exchange, wishing that it was more fruitful. However, he doesn't have any time to dwell on this, as he needs to find the source of all of this energy, but unfortunately, as the champion traverses the tower, the indicator leads him deep below, into a place that he's only ever been once before, during the early days of the construction of the tower, a place that only his brother has access to. Now we pan back to the battlefield, and after a brief intermission, both Brock and Jazelle find themselves staring each other down once more. While Jazelle has an aura of confidence about her, Brock, on the other hand, is questioning his next move. She's looking to pick apart his team, and now that his starter is gone, Brock isn't feeling as confident as he was when he went into this. And not only that, but he doesn't have Stunky to battle with him. However, there is one thing that Brock has going for him that Jazelle doesn't. He has many people confident in his abilities, backing him, from the memory of his mother to the strength of his father, and the friendship with his traveling companion Joe. The boy refuses to let Jazelle get the better of him as he readies his next Pokeball. Regardless of her choice, he will be the victor here, as they both are given the command to start the second half of the battle. Wasting no time, Jazelle decides that it's time to start with someone fresh, as she declares, "Kabutops, go!" The living fossil of Sice pops from the Pokeball with a brief hiss, signifying that it's ready to engage in any encounter that may befall before it. While on the other hand, Brock has decided to go with the support system, as he declares, "Gyarados, your time to battle!" The water serpent emerges from its Pokeball with a mighty roar that rings throughout the stadium, signaling that it is going to take down any opposition that stands before it. The presence of Gyarados is exactly why Jazelle decided to go with Kabutops here. She knew that Brock would fall back to it once Colossal was taken out, and with Kabutops being half rock and half water, it's her best chance that she thinks to take out the serpent. So with no further delay, she begins her commands as she tells her rock type to use a Stone Edge. However, Brock isn't going to take any chances, as he commands an Aqua Tail that knocks away the stones, sending them back flying in the direction of Kabutops. Now, while this isn't super effective, the stones hitting them on is going to cause a little bit of damage to it, which makes it briefly flinch, and Brock decides to take full advantage of this new opening as he commands for his serpent to use a Dragon Dance. Gyarados, showing its ferocity in battle, executes the move perfectly as it slinks across the battlefield and coils around Kabutops, increasing both its speed and its attack. However, just as it begins to enclose on Kabutops with its coil, the rock type quickly evades with an Aqua Jet, getting out of harm's way before firing back with the Mud Shot. Now, while this doesn't cause any damage to Gyarados because of its flying typing, it is enough to temporarily blind the serpent, so that way Kabutops can gain some much needed distance, as once again it fires another Stone Edge, to which this time Gyarados is unable to see coming, and it ends up taking head on for some serious damage. This causes the serpent to get a little bit frustrated. However, Brock calls to it, telling it to remain calm. He will be its eyes. Just listen to the sound of its voice. Gyarados, for once in its rage-filled life, cools its head as it begins to drown out all of the cheers of the surrounding crowd, so that way it can focus on the movement of Kabutops. It quickly begins to pick up on the footsteps of the ancient rock type as it darts across the battlefield, trying to close the gap between the two. This is where Brock tells the serpent to be ready. They have one chance at this. However, Jazelle is still confident, as she commands Kabutops to use a Giga Drain to gain back some of its HP. However, as it closes in, this is when Brock executes his strategy, telling Gyarados to use a bulldoze that the serpent is able to slam its body into Kabutops for some massive damage, sending the rock type into the stadium barrier. While this isn't enough to knock it out, it does have an adverse effect, as Kabutops is now moving a little bit slower as it tries to stand back up from taking that damage. Realizing getting in close will be a death sentence, Jazelle decides to strike from far away as she orders a Stone Edge. However, Gyarados isn't going to let this happen, as Brock commands for a Dragon Dance that it uses to evade any of the stones coming its way, while simultaneously increasing its attack and speed. This makes Gyarados near impossible to hit from a distance, and the only way for Kabutops to be able to cause any damage is for it to get in close, which Jazelle reluctantly has to deal with, commanding the rock type in with the Giga Drain. This is the moment Brock was waiting for, as he wastes no time calling for an Aqua Tail. Now that Gyarados has figured out the attack patterns of Kabutops, it's a mere matter of moments before the tail slams into the rock type, sending it careening back into the stadium barrier with spirals in its eyes, as it has declared the loser of this battle. Jazelle recalls the fossil, not quite happy with the outcome that just transpired, as that was the only thing that she had planned to take down Gyarados. But it and Brock's bond has grown even stronger since the last time she saw it, so she's going to need something that can withstand that massive attack and power from the serpent. However, she feels like she has just the thing, as she readies a Pokeball, declaring, "Corviknight, go!" The Galarian bird emerges from its ball with a clanging herd as its wings beat with its feathers clapping together. While Brock knows that Gyarados did take a decent amount of damage in that battle, he has one real truth that he has to honor, and the fact is that Gyarados is probably his best chance right now. With all the stat buffs that it's received, it'll be the best option he has to stand up to Giselle's armor-clad bird. So, with the start of the next battle given to begin, Jazelle wastes no time in ordering it in with a Steel Wing, to which Brock decides to counter with a Dragon Pulse. However, this is going to do little to deter the Steel type as it pushes through the Dragonic Energy Beam, taking whatever damage is dealt to it before slamming its wings into the belly of Gyarados. This was a pretty impressive hit, as it caused the serpent to slide back ever so slightly, while Corviknight takes back to the sky to put some distance between the two. Realizing they don't really have a means to attack the Steel type, Brock tells Gyarados to continue on with the Dragon Pulses. The serpent fires into the sky in an attempt to hit at its opponent. However, Corviknight is able to use its airbound advantage to easily outpace majority of the beams, merely taking what are the equivalent to pot shots in damage. This is exactly what Jazelle wanted, as before long it becomes apparent that Gyarados is beginning to tire itself out, as the serpent is breathing heavily. This is where Jazelle decides to execute her plan, as she tells the Steel type to use a Drill Peck. Once again, Corviknight dives with all of the weight that it has on its body behind it, allowing it to pick up some massive speed and power as its beak sharpens itself and prepares to drive itself into the hide of Gyarados. Realizing that they're only going to have one shot at this, Brock tells the serpent to ready its tail. They're going to have to execute this on a split second's notice. Knowing what its trainer has in mind, Gyarados' tail begins to glow in an aqua hue as Corviknight breaks the sound barrier before colliding with the belly of Gyarados. The last thing the serpent can do before it is knocked back into the barrier is smack the Steel type with an aqua tail that sends it into the barrier on the opposite side, as they both collapse under their own weight. For a moment, silence befalls the stadium as everyone awaits to see if either Pokemon is going to be able to get up. While Gyarados is struggling, it is still able to move slightly, while Corviknight on the other hand has begun to rise as well. But unfortunately for Brock, his serpent is going to collapse again under its own weight, as it no longer has the health to proceed, with it falling over with spirals in its eyes, giving Jazelle yet another win against Brock. However, it didn't come without cost, as it's clear that Corviknight felt that last Aqua Tail, as the bird is having trouble flapping its wings to regain altitude. As Brock recalls the serpent, the only thing he could think to himself is, how did he let it get this far out of hand? He was in control in the beginning of the battle, but Jazelle is doing exactly what she promised, slowly picking apart his team one by one. While on the opposite side of the field, Jazelle is beating herself up a bit, as she's upset that Corviknight took that massive amount of damage. She really wanted to use it for G-maxing if it was going to come down to it, but now it would be kind of pointless considering with how much health it has left. So she decides that she's just going to leave it in, and she'll save Dynamaxing for one of her other two Pokemon that she still has. However, she's going to get a pleasant surprise when their next opponent emerges from its Pokeball, as Brock declares, "Galvantula, your time to battle!" Spider pops from its ball once again, ready to take on Corviknight. However, it is clear that this thing has taken some damage, and Corviknight, being a Steel Flying type, is not in the best interests of the Bug type, but Brock has no choice. He needs its electricity in order to take out this thing. So with the command to start their next battle, Jazelle wastes no time in trying to end this with one move, ordering for a Drill Peck. However, this time Corviknight isn't able to gain as much altitude as it did before, forcing it to dive from about 3 to 4 meters above Galvantula. But this is going to be more than enough, as Brock's efforts to try and deter it with an Electro Web is cut through by the armor-clad bird's wings as it closes in on Galvantula. However, this is exactly what Brock wanted, as he tells the Arachnid to jump up in the air with Corviknight unable to pull up. This forces it to drive its beak straight into the ground, with Galvantula coming down down on top of it. The bird begins to flail about, trying to pull its head out of the battlefield, but unfortunately it's unable to before Brock gives his final command, as he orders his spider to use a discharge that floods the steel flying type with as much electricity as possible before the flailing comes to a stop, and Corviknight lays there, limp, with its head still stuck in the ground. Galvantula then dismounts the ironclad bird as it's recalled by Jazelle, with the girl a bit upset that she didn't see that coming. However, she has little time to beat herself up over it, as she needs to continue the battle. They both only have 2 Pokemon left. However, Galvantula is looking a bit drained, and all of her other Pokemon have had time to rest. So, wasting no time, she decides to send back in her Galarian form of Slowbro as it pops from the ball, ready to engage once more. It's here that the wave for the next round is given to begin, and Brock wastes no time, calling for another Electro Web that the spider fires in the direction of Slowbro. However, Jazelle just merely has it take it, telling the Psychic type to use a Slack Off to increase whatever HP that it has lost. This puts it nearly at full health once again. However, Brock thinks 2 can play at that game, as he orders Galvantula down the battlefield, and to connect with the Giga Drain. While the spider is successful in closing the distance between the two and sinking its fangs into Slowbro, fact of the matter is, it's not going to have much of a chance to cause any serious damage here, as the Galarian tank is going to be able to stave off any massive bits of damage due to its poison typing, allowing Jazelle to retaliate with a Zen Headbutt that Slowbro is able to easily execute, slamming its head into the small head of the arachnid, forcing it to break the grip that it had due to the Giga Drain. This creates an opening for Jazelle, as she decides to take full advantage of it, commanding her Psychic type to use Disable once more. That catches the spider, making it unable to move. Then, in a burst of ooze, Brock can do nothing but watch as Galvantula takes another shell sidearm, as it's covered in purple ooze once again. However, fortunately for the boy, this isn't enough to take out Galvantula, as just as Slowbro breaks the Disable on it, it's able to execute a discharge that engulfs the Psychic type for some serious damage before Galvantula collapses under the stress of the battles that it has had, making it unable to proceed any further with spirals in its eyes. As the electricity dissipates from around Slowbro, it is singed with a bit of smoke coming off of it. However, it is still able to battle, with Brock recalling his bug type, contemplating how everything is played out, while Jazelle is just tickled pink that Brock is down to his last Pokemon, and according to her, it's that pathetic Stunky that lost in the first battle with Alister the previous day, so she knows that this is going to be a for sure win. However, as Brock places Galvantula's ball back on his belt, he pulls out the one that was given to him by Joe. Looking up at his friend in the stand, Joe gives Brock a nod, almost to say all of their hopes and faiths are with him. He believes in Brock, and so does his Pokemon. So let's win this. It's here that Brock pans his view back to Jazelle, as she is super giddy, urging Brock to send in his last Pokemon. She wants to get this over with, so that way she can finally close out this chapter and move on to the finals. However, he's going to have a rude awakening for the princess, as he declares, "Sableye, your time to battle!" Jazelle's jaw hits the floor as the ghastly gremlin emerges from the Pokeball with a brief shriek of its name before looking around. "Wait, that's not your Pokemon," Jazelle says. "That belongs to Joe. What are you doing using a Pokemon that doesn't belong to you?" However, Brock stops her dead in her tirade, telling her that technically Sableye does belong to Brock, as Joe and him traded for it this morning. This is where we pan back to the Pokemon Center when Joe was offering Brock his Pokemon. Joe clarified the rules that were inside of the manual, telling him that all of the Pokemon that he uses in the battle have to be registered to him, so there is a way around it. If they just temporarily trade Pokemon, then Brock can use Sableye, and he'll just hold on to Stunky's ball for the time being. While Brock was opposed at this at first, he quickly came around to it when he realized that he wasn't going to have many other options. And Sableye, even though it is technically a different Pokemon than Stunky, it does share similar qualities to it, so it would be easy for Brock and it to get in sync. So, realizing that there wasn't any other options, the two initiated the trade, as we pan back to the current time with Brock explaining to Jazelle exactly what happened. Sableye is technically his Pokemon, and he intends to use it in this battle as a gift from Joe to finally show her exactly why she won't be able to beat him. This causes the girl to become extremely frustrated as she lets out a loud growl, demanding that the referee disqualify Brock for this. However, the official declares that this Pokemon was registered this morning with Brock's team. It is officially his in the Pokédex, so there's nothing he can do about it. Either Jazelle chooses to battle, or she will be forced to forfeit. This is her option, and she has a minute to comply. Realizing there's nothing she can do, as Chairman Rose has yet to intervene, Jazelle chooses to accept these terms, as she tells Brock that no matter what, she's still going to be able to beat Sableye Sableye, no matter who it belongs to. So, with her acknowledgement to start the next battle, they both begin. However, this is where Jazelle's frustrations are going to play a big role in what happens next, as she quickly comes to realize that she doesn't know anything about Sableye. Even though her and Joe traveled together for so long, she spent so much time fixated on Brock's Pokemon and what he could do with them that she never paid attention to him and his Pokemon. And Brock is able to easily take advantage of this as it uses a Shadow Claw to drop Galarian Slowbro, when a Zen Headbutt fails to have any effect on it, bringing this battle to a 1v1. With another frustrated growl, she recalls the Psychic type, contemplating her next move. She only has one Pokemon left, and Marowak took a massive amount of damage battling against Colossal. However, it looks like she's gonna have to use it regardless if she wants to or not, but luckily, she still has Dynamax. So, with the urge from the official to send in her final Pokemon, Jazelle sends back in her starter as Marowak hits the field with its bone twirling, ready to engage with Sableye. This is actually the first time that the two Mons have had to square off in a battle, and they are similar in stature and what seems to be power. However, Jazelle wastes no time in activating the Dynamax phenomenon, recalling Marowak so that way it can grow in size, to try and use this increase in power to squash the Ghost type. However, Brock remains undeterred, telling Sableye that they can do this, they just have to remain confident, while the Ghost type just looks on with a blank stare on its face, unsure of really what's happening. This irritates Jazelle even more, as she calls for a Max Quake. However, Sableye is able to easily dodge this, as it uses a Disable to prevent it from causing any damage to the Ghost type. Brock then tells the little goblin to use an Icy Wind that is able to envelop the entire battlefield, striking Marowak for some decent damage even though it's a Kaiju-sized Mon. However, Jazelle isn't going to let the assault continue from the Ice-type attack, as she calls for a Max Knuckle that deters most of the damage that Marowak would have taken, and it slams into Sableye, or what she thinks slams into it, as the Ghost typing comes into play, preventing any serious damage to Sableye. It's here that Brock decides it's time, as he recalls Sableye initiating the Dynamax phenomenon, choosing to make the Gremlin building size for the first time in its life. As Sableye emerges from the ball, it takes in the surroundings of everything that is happening, unsure of what just happened and why Joe and Brock both look like insects compared to it. However, Brock tells the Ghost type they need to focus. They need to take out Marowak now, as Jazelle and Marowak are on their final turn of Dynamax, and she is calling for a Max Quake to try and cause as much damage. Brock decides to counter this by ordering a Max Hailstorm. Suddenly, a blizzard begins to set in on the stadium, as the temperature drops to near freezing, making Marowak unable to really move to get off a full power Max Quake. This hits it for serious damage, as the Kaiju Mon then topples over, succumbing to all of the injuries that it has sustained in this massively long 6-on-6 battle. It then reverts in size, as Jazelle drops to her knees with spirals in Marowak's eyes, giving Brock the win. Brock just stands there, not really happy or sad. It's not celebrating, as Sableye stares down at the trainer and then back at Joe, confused about the entire situation. As to the Ghost type, this whole Dynamax thing feels really unnatural, and it would just like it to end as quickly as possible. However, Brock isn't going to make Sableye wait any longer, as he recalls it before walking over to the middle of the battlefield where Jazelle stands, with tears in her eyes as she looks at Brock and then to Marowak. The boy goes to say something, but the only thing he can get out is Jazelle before she recalls Marowak and takes off running out of the stadium. Brock just stands there in silence as Joe watches on. For whatever reason, neither one of them seems satisfied with this outcome, as we fade to the next match with Leon standing in the battlefield. However, his opponent, the champion of the Galar region, Peony, has yet to show, and the call went out for him quite some time ago. If the champion doesn't show up, then he's going to be disqualified. Both Brock and Joe watch from the stands, wondering what has happened to Peony, as Leon awaits the arrival of his sponsor. And this is where we're going to leave things for now. So tell me, how did you feel about this part? Did you enjoy the battle that Brock had with Jazelle? How about the fact that Joe let him use Sableye to compensate for what's going on with Stunky? What do you guys think is going on with the Dark type? And of course, what was Peony tracking from the wild area, and why was it in Rose Tower? All this and more will be answered in the next episode, which is the finale of this scenario. Let me know your guys' thoughts and comments down below. And that's all we had for today's video. I really appreciate you guys stopping by to watch all the way to the end, and I just wanted to say thank you for that. If you guys really enjoy my content, consider following me on some of my other platforms like Discord, where you can get to know other people who are interested in what ifs, or on Twitter, where I post sometimes behind the scenes updates. Or if you want to help the channel grow a little bit extra, why don't you consider donating like the people right here have, as whatever you could offer could help us get to a larger audience by helping us get new videos done, or some of the projects that we've been more custom art is getting kind of expensive, so we want to make sure that we have the funds to do that. But with all that being said, I really hope you guys enjoyed everything, and I will see you in the next video.